Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. It's my pleasure today to be joined by Dr. William Blair, who is the Liberal Arts Research Professor in U.S. History at Penn State University, as well as the Director of the Richards Civil War Era Center and editor of the Journal of the Civil War Era. He wears many hats. But today we are talking about his most recent work, With Malice Towards Some, Treason and Loyalty in the Civil War Era, which is now out with the University of North Carolina Press. So Dr. Blair, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Now, I think a lot of us, we tend to think if we know a fair amount about the war, we know Lincoln, we know some of his criticisms of the press and trying to crack down on opposition, but I don't think there's been really a whole lot in terms of studying treason during the war. So if you could you just start us off by giving us a bit of an overview of what the book's really about?
Sure. It really takes us on a tour through the antebellum period all the way to early Reconstruction, I should say, and trying to look at how people use this concept of treason to enact policy and do certain things to certain people. In other words, how they justified arrests, how they justified taking slaves, how they seized property from Confederates, how they punished who they believed were disloyal people, even within their own backyards. Somehow or other, they had to come up with a reason for doing this. And they more often than not used treason as their framework. But it wasn't free treason in the courts. That's one of the anomalies here. The Supreme Court was actually, with just a couple of rare exceptions, not the place that this battle was played out. It's really played out on the streets and in notions of what I call popular constitutionalism. In other words, what mattered was what people thought was legal, what they thought was constitutional, and then how they turned that into action against other people.
Now, you do mention that we start in the late antebellum period with this work. I wondered if you could just perhaps give us a bit of that overview in the sense of how was treason approached as a topic, I guess, in the late antebellum period, even before the war starts.
Right. Well, treason, just to be clear to everybody, is the only crime that's in the Constitution. It was put there and made that way deliberately to keep it hard to apply, making hard to take treason to a level of political opposition and political purging, really. So the founders wanted to make sure you had to actually commit an overt act of war, and it had to be an overt act that was witnessed by two independent people. So again, it was to try to end the practices they saw happening under the English, who used treason a lot to punish just typically political opposition. Well, the odd part is, in the antebellum period, is that tendency never went away. On the one hand, the court system was coming up with a narrower definition of treason and trying to be faithful to the Constitution. But on the other hand, people were trying to use it a lot as a political tool to chill an opposition. And the chapter that deals with the antebellum period especially deals with the anti-abolition assaults, beginning in Kansas especially. And there, what I never knew until doing this work was how much of the Kansas turmoil revolved around the issue of treason. And I did not realize that Franklin Pierce had come out against the anti-slavery government in Kansas and basically condemned them in the press as being traitors who would be prosecuted as such. And John Brown's son was actually charged with treason, and numerous abolitionists in that area, including the governor of the anti-slavery forces, were all charged with treason at that time, and it was a treason that was definitely intended to chill a political opposition and try to silence them. And obviously, it didn't work. And then, of course, the most famous treason trial, maybe in American history, to be honest, was John Brown, who in 1859, when he attacked the federal installation at Harper's Ferry, was actually hauled up on treason charges. And again, you have to keep thinking about, they had other things they could charge him with. They could charge him with murder, they could charge him with insurrection, they could charge him with a variety of well-established crimes. But in the antebellum period through, in fact, Reconstruction, treason was the means of coming up with the biggest symbolic charge that you could weigh against any kind of individual. So they charged him with treason, and unfortunately they didn't do it in the federal aspect. They changed it to a state treason charge, which was quite common back then to have state treason on the books. And he became the first person convicted and hanged for treason in the United States since the founding of the Constitution. So the lesson is that even though the courts were, during that whole period, trying to narrow the definition of treason, the tendency never ended for people to try to use it to go against political opponents. And that, frankly, is a continuity that carried into the Civil War.
Now, I think this is just a personal quirk of mine, but I'm always attracted towards chapter titles for some reason. I don't know why. And one of yours includes Atlantic World flavor within it. And that caught my eye. And I wondered if you could perhaps explain just a little bit what you mean by that.
Well, honestly, it's a chapter that arose only during the course of research. It's not a chapter I even planned to write at the time. But as I was going through the Congressional Globe and some of my other sources, including political tracts that were being produced, popular constitutional tracts, especially by just amateur people, not lawyers, not historians, not anybody who you would think had the expertise, I kept seeing these references to some legal authorities outside of the United States. And I kept scratching my head about it. The guy who kept coming up a lot was Emmerich de Vattel, who is a Swiss who wrote in the 18th century a book called The Law of Nations. And I kept thinking to myself, what the heck is this thing? I've never encountered this before, although it is in certain books in the literature at least mentioned, but it was new to me. And so I had to do some digging on my own, and what I started to find, and why I said with an Atlantic World flavor, is that our Constitution was not enough during the Civil War in order to decide some of these great issues of civil liberties and persecution of political opponents and, frankly, presidential war powers. If you look at the Constitution, it tells you that the president has the power to protect us against insurrection and to lead us in war. But what that means beyond that, you're making up as you go. And as I kept digging, I kept finding out that their main authorities for deciding what were presidential powers, how could you seize slaves, how could you carry out war that was kind of hard, like Sherman and Grant did later on, was coming out of, well, the rationale for all of this was coming out of these authorities such as Vattel and the Law of Nations. Now, the funny thing is that the laws of war were also cited a lot, and these are international practices, and none of that is written down. It's really vexing because you can't go to a source, you can't say, okay, here is the authority that they're citing and what they're trying to find. The laws of war are just what people's ideas were about practices of warfare in the 19th century. And they leaned on that a lot as well. And Lincoln would occasionally cite the laws of war, especially when he defended emancipation. So what I concluded was that the strain of constitutional argument that says the Constitution was sufficient to get us through the Civil War, I don't think it was. I think it was sufficient in certain areas, but that in all the places where you needed to go to seize slaves, to be more radical, to envision a harder war against the enemy, you had to justify that by using international law.
Now, once we move into the war proper, I think it's important to note that provost marshals become very important in all of this. So I wondered if you could perhaps give us just a bit of an overview of what a provost marshal actually is, and then how did provost marshals actually operate on a practical level during the war and these kind of spheres of operation that they had.
Okay, you got a couple of hours? First of all, this is another chapter I never intended to write, but as I was frankly writing the book, I kept realizing I had no idea who was doing these arrests, under what authority, and how. And so I started doing more digging and realizing there's a real quagmire out there. First of all, for your listeners, think of the provost marshal as we would call him a military policeman today. And they started out as being the police for the army, and they were to really keep the soldiers in line, keep them out of brothels, keep them out of taverns, and do all those things to prevent their moral degradation. And, if they committed crimes and so on, they would they would be under arrest by the provost marshal. Provost marshal was always also with the army, had the unhappy task of standing behind the men with sabers and guns and making sure that anybody didn't run from the ranks during an assault. Not a very appealing situation. And of course, they were prison guards. They would hold prisoners and on the various aspects, including Confederate prisoners, until they were processed and gotten rid of. So that's the basic theory, but then the Civil War became much more complicated because of the nature of the beast and how you have to think back that at this time there is no Department of Justice even, there's no FBI, there's no Central Intelligence Agency, there is absolutely no mechanism for policing disloyalty on the home front and sedition and so on. No federal mechanism, no Homeland Security. So what you started to see developing in communities is a patchwork quilt of different people. At first, even provost marshals were just sort of people who would be created by, say, Benjamin Butler or someone else who might be in Maryland, and they needed help with policing the home front. Maryland especially was known for having some dissenters and potentially opponents of the war. And so how do you get these people arrested? You draft a local guy who was your local volunteer fireman, and he gets invested with police powers. It's not even clear to me whether he was paid by the federal government or not. I'm not even sure about that. But you just draft him. Or you use Police Superintendent Kennedy in New York, and you claim he's a provost marshal. And suddenly what you do is give these people the right to begin arresting and policing dissent on the home front. And of course, that's going to be in the eye of the beholder, whatever they think is dissent and disloyalty that needs to be arrested. So already you have one set of provost marshals who were just supposed to be with the army. Then you have another set of provost marshals who are called special or civilian provosts, who are just drafted to help out on the home front. And then you had a third group of provost marshals because wherever a military department was set up, and there were about 11 of them established throughout the United States at that time, they had their own bureaucracy, their own provost marshals, again to police and patrol that segment of the United States that was designated a military department. So the Department of Ohio, for example, that was overseen by Burnside, was a very large territory that extended into Kentucky and other places. But he had his own set of provost marshals who would be conducting arrests and answering to him, and not necessarily answering to Washington itself. So what you have is a veritable mess. You have independent agents who were more interested in local issues and battles, the civilian provosts. You had army provosts who would be traveling with the army, and they might be passing in and out of jurisdictions in any given moment. Then you had the fixed military provosts who would be in charge of a department, and they would be trying to keep order as well. And by the way, I didn't even add another layer. And this is where this gets really mind-blowing. Then in 1863, of course, the federal government decided to have a national draft. And in order to organize and enforce that draft, and also to catch deserters, they created another layer of provost marshals who were supposed to do just that. So depending on where you were, if you lived in a community like Missouri that might have a military department, that might have an army there, that might have all of these other things, you could have 3 to 4 different provost marshals sometimes engaged in the same area. And by the way, in Missouri, they actually spied on each other and arrested each other as well.
That sounds exhausting from a researching standpoint, just to try and, not to mention confusing, trying to decipher between all those various layers and how they're interacting with one another.
The beauty of it, though, is it plays into two major themes in the book. And one of the major themes is, of course, that administrative controls at that time were lousy. They were fraught with holes. They weren't perfect. The national government that we tend to think of didn't exist at that time. Government centralized to an extent, but there were so many holes in this fabric, and patronage was still very much alive in appointing a lot of these provost marshals. It's not an exaggeration to say that the civil provosts and even the provost marshals who oversaw conscription, I hate to put it this way, were no more than political hacks. And they had party interests at heart. They often were beholden to the party officials in their communities. So what this means is, not only was the centralized authority more filled with holes than what I think most historians say today, but it also meant how you could interpret Lincoln as well. I mean, he could be, as I am convinced he was, more restrained than most people in his beliefs in policing civil liberties. That he had some egregious areas, he did, but he still was very restrained compared to what he could have been. And yet, because of the nature of the beast and the holes that were in this so-called internal security system, what you find at the local level and at the ground level is a veritable mess with abuses and with all sorts of validation of democratic complaints about arbitrary authority.
Now, as the war comes to a close, for those that obviously have even a vague familiarity with American history, know we didn't set up a rash of treason trials throughout the South and even parts of the North once the war ends. Obviously, there's some very high-profile arrests and temporary imprisonments with people like Jefferson Davis. Henry Wirz, commandant in Andersonville, very famously is tried. But we, as I said, we don't have this whole rash of people being tried for treason. So what happens when the war ends, I suppose? Why are these people not tried with treason? But then how is it used as a political tool, I guess, in Reconstruction?
Sure. First up, I'm going to say that what surprised me the most when I first started the project was the extent to which treason was still on the table in 1865. I thought it was off the table. I thought with the paroles at Appomattox and other things that meant you were not going to get major treason trials. But when I first started doing the work, I suddenly realized that we don't account for federalism very well in the Civil War. We tend to always go to, and historians, I think, naturally are drawn toward the national big picture. But if you started looking at the state level, you saw almost 2,000 treason cases in Tennessee alone that were on the books. You found in Maryland they wanted to prosecute 4,000 cases, especially people who left to go to the Confederate Army. They had people they were holding in prison at that time who lived in limbo until you could figure out whether the state was going to move with treason trials or not. And then when I looked at Johnson's papers in the National Archives, especially the amnesty papers, instead of finding all these people just writing and saying, let them go, I found tons of papers that said, hang them, and hang them high, and really make an example out of them. So, first of all, that surprised me that it was even worse than I thought when I started going into this issue, and there was more momentum, I thought, for potentially bringing a few traitors to justice and hanging a few, when I never expected that to be the case. Well, then, okay, why the heck didn't it happen? There's already a little misunderstanding out there because I started giving Grant a little bit of credit for the paroles at Appomattox, but I don't think that's what took it off the table. And in fact, my work actually showed that people like Francis Lieber, a lawyer at the time and a government consultant, if you will, the man who wrote the Code of War, he was one of many who believed you could still prosecute these guys, that once the war ended, the paroles, prisoner exchange systems, all that were done, and it was a new ballgame. But what became apparent were several things that was going on, and I think the first and most practical thing that was happening was that the major imperative of the war and immediate aftermath was reunion. And one of the things you don't do if you want to reach out and create a new country is kill a bunch of people who were your opponents. It kind of makes it harder to have reconciliation. And so, that being the basic impulse, the first thing you're not going to do is rush in and kill and hang a lot of rebels. But secondly, the mechanisms that we had in place as law in this country made it difficult. You had to, according to law and precedent, try individuals, and you've heard this, I'm sure, in the place where they have committed the crime. We still do that today. Well, back then, you had to figure out if we're going to try Jefferson Davis and Lee and all of these people. And Lee, by the way, for those who don't know, was indicted for treason and was kind of shocked by it and sought help from Grant to get himself off the hook. But if you're going to try these guys, where are you going to do it? And all legal authorities said, well, we have to do it in Virginia. That's where the seat of the Confederate capital was. That's where the decisions were made. And that's where, if we're going to try Jefferson Davis, that's where it has to be. Okay, it's 1865. What's the status of allies that you would have in Virginia to be able to maybe either bring either an impartial trial or, let's face it, they wanted to convict him, not let him go. Who's going to be on your side? Black people, maybe? Yeah, probably. They're not part of the electorate. They're at that time not even allowed to sit on juries. They will eventually be selected for a jury that was packed to have mostly black people, but that was never went to trial. So you're going to get mainly former Confederates, all these white men who had been either sympathetic to or in the Confederate Army, and they're going to be the ones deciding whether Jefferson Davis committed treason. Can you afford that if you're the federal government? And a lot of people started to think, oh my gosh, we just can't move ahead with that trial. And then even if you do, ever since John Marshall established this precedent back in the antebellum period, it was well known that if one person was guilty of treason, everyone was. That in treason there are no such things as accessories. Everyone is a principal. What does that mean? That means if Jefferson Davis is guilty, so is a private in the Confederate Army. So is the politician who served in the Confederate legislature and voted on armaments for the military. So are all these people who voted for conscription and so on. And the question is, where the heck do you stop the bloodbath? You cannot convict 500,000 men for treason. So there were some practical considerations that helped stop that momentum for treason. But I still think it's really the imperative to have reunion that is the driving force. Because even the abolitionists, which shocked me, the old abolitionists like Horace Greeley, who used to cry for blood, Garrett Smith, who helped fund John Brown's raid, they were the first to belly up to the bar of leniency and ask for no treason trials. And so if you take away those people from the table and you have reunion as the imperative and you have legal system that really makes this a mess and very much a problem to prosecute, I think for all those reasons you just start to back yourself away from treason trials. However, as I think you alluded to, the rebels were still punished. I think we have to remember that. One of the reasons that I like what I did in Reconstruction in terms of sorting out some of these issues was because I always wondered why Confederates complained so much about Reconstruction. It seemed like they actually got their way. And I think from our standpoint, they resisted doing presidential Reconstruction. They got hammered doing congressional Reconstruction, of course. But then they pretty much got their way back in redemption and when they started to be back into power. So what the heck are they complaining about? And the answer is that when you start to see how people did punish the rebels, you realize through the 14th Amendment especially, they did such things as repudiate all of their war debts. Now, that doesn't sound like much to us today. It's like, okay, ho hum. However, if you have been a Confederate who has sunk every blessed cent of your money into state governments or Confederate governments, and you come out of that war losing all of your slaves also, suddenly you're being told you're penniless. You have lost all recourse of getting back those funds. They were pretty upset about that, and they were resistant to it, and even Johnson had to come down hard on North Carolina and South Carolina to try to get those legislatures to repudiate the war debts. So that's one way you punish them. Confiscation of property, that was never returned. People who lost their property during the war received no money for it, and the federal government did not say even as much as an apology. So huge economic impact, and of course the loss of power by losing your slaves and losing all of your labor in the South. So I began to see why Confederates could be quite angry, and they were punished, at least to the extent you could be, through the 14th Amendment and other mechanisms.
Now, Dr. Blair, I'll let you go on this question. What's the ultimate hope, I guess, for you in terms of this work? What do you hope is kind of the takeaway for someone who's picking up this book, examining treason in the Civil War era?
Unfortunately, some of them I don't even like. I have to admit, one of the takeaways from the book to me, there's several. First of all, I think if I had a main message, it would be just look at the dirty business you needed to do to conduct a civil war. As much as I sit there and see what I believe were some egregious acts by the administration, especially monkeying at the polls by soldiers, which was much more extensive than I ever expected. And it may have influenced several elections, and it certainly helped the outcome for the 38th Congress. And by that I mean soldiers standing at the polls and literally screening ballots and not letting administration opponents drop their tickets into the ballot box. It's pretty blatant and pretty egregious. Well, the problem is that we get back again to the administrative controls and what you know about what's going on in these communities and so on. And what you see is they really didn't always know what was going on. They really had no way of assessing the threat, and really coming up with reasoned responses to what might be happening. Instead, the circumstances were set up so that the dirty business of policing disloyalty was going to stay dirty and sometimes commit arbitrary acts. So that's one takeaway from it, which means that I don't really feel comfortable with us reaching back and using the Civil War for a precedent in these measures for contemporary issues. Well, the second thing is one that makes me, and I almost don't want to mention it, but really the Democrats had more legitimate complaints against the administration than I ever expected they had. They are the whipping boys and whipping girls in the Civil War literature. They are the people to hate because they were, racists who deployed the race card a lot in elections. They were, of course, anti-Lincoln in certain respects. They sometimes, if you were the peace Democrats, you were actually against prosecuting the war further and looking for an armistice, which who knows if that would have kept separate nations or not. So they're not a very appealing group of people. But really, when I started doing this work on what was happening at the grassroots level with treason, I started to realize that, oh my God, I may not have thought they were so wacky at the time. And that they had some very, very legitimate complaints against the Lincoln government. A third thing that I never expected to find was the extent to which, and this is an offshoot of the controlling voting, but we always care about black suffrage after the Civil War, but we never look at white suffrage. And there was a lot of attempts by especially border state politicians and even the upper north, or the upper border north, such as Pennsylvania and Ohio, to control the polling precincts through questionable ways, even into Reconstruction, in order to prop up Republican regimes. West Virginia and Missouri existed as Republican governments until 1870, largely because of interference with the polls and the disqualification and disfranchisement of former Confederates and Confederate loyalists. That was a total surprise to me, and I never saw that in other parts of the literature. That's three. So
There you go. Well, those are some intriguing takeaways, I guess I should say, and something for people to think about as they pick up this book, I should say, and I hope they do. Again, it's with Malice Towards Some, Treason and Loyalty in the Civil War Era, out with UNC Press. Really fascinating read. I know I say that often here on the program, but it truly is, and it's going to make you think a bit differently, as you say, regarding treason. And the language associated with it, and the methods that are being employed to pursue it. So, Dr. Blair, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to speak with us, and hopefully we can have you back on again in the future.
be terrific. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.